Call on Members' Order of the Day number 1.
Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill, Committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill. Mr Chairman.
Mr Speaker. Members, the House is in committee on the Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill. The question is that Clause 1 stand part.
Mr Chair.
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to speak on the second reading of the Social Security Clothing Allowances for Orphans and Unsupported Children Amendment Bill. It's a bill that Labor has supported all the way through, and I continue to commend the member Tracy Martin for bringing this important bill before the House. I want to raise a couple of issues in this committee stage which relates to the technical detail. But first of all, I just want to, again, for the benefit of the House, briefly traverse the difference, which is captured in the title, between those who are in receipt of an unsupported child benefit or an orphan's benefit versus those who receive support for caring for a child who is in their care as a foster child. Obviously, this bill is very specific to those who receive an unsupported child benefit. Now, in New Zealand, unfortunately, circumstances mean that many of those individuals are grandparents raising grandchildren, or those who are often described as kinship carers. They are in the devastating situation of their children not being in a position to care for their grandchildren, and often reluctantly, at great expense, have to acknowledge that they would be better off in their own care. Many of these individuals are living on pensions. Some scrape together meagre incomes through part-time work. All, however, have made a decision to put their grandchildren first, and we should applaud them for that. Particularly, I want to applaud the group that's been organised since roughly 1999 under Diane Vivian, Grandparents Raising Grandchildren, who have been excellent advocates for change in this area. Qualifying for an unsupported child benefit is quite a test. You have to demonstrate family breakdown. Now, that in itself is quite a difficult thing to demonstrate. You may have a biological parent who is very unwilling to accept their inability to care appropriately for the grandchild in question. And so that in itself can be a hard test to demonstrate to work and income, who often require family members to openly agree that there's been family breakdown and inability to support that child. It's a difficult test. They also require there to be a long period of time where a grandparent has actually been caring for that grandchild unsupported before they qualify. And I know a lot of members in this House would have probably been advocates. I do think there's room to look, therefore, at the test, the threshold test for those families. But the distinction within the legislation that exists that the member is trying to remedy is that in qualifying for that unsupported child benefit, you don't automatically qualify for the same support that a foster carer would receive, and that is what this bill seeks to remedy. The Select Committee found, however, that in Clause 29B, which is the substantive part of the bill, it basically sets out how administratively it would apply the extension of receiving a clothing allowance, which is the one bit of foster care support that we're trying to transfer now to someone receiving an unsupported child benefit. And it does that, it's changed the way the original form of this bill would do that. The Select Committee has changed it basically by making a reference in the Child, Youth and Family Act around rates of payments to persons or organisations who are in charge of a child. Now, why have they made a general cross-reference rather than just simply stating in law that you would receive a clothing allowance? Well, the Select Committee point out the reason is that because the clause as drafted may give the impression that the Chief Executive is required to determine such an allowance. However, Section 363 of the Children and Young Persons and Their Family Act relates to the Chief Executive's discretion to determine the rates of allowances payable to caregivers of foster children. We believe the amendment would clarify that although a clothing allowance is currently provided for foster children, the provisions as well as the amount provided is at the Chief Executive's discretion. It's somewhat concerning that such an important allowance is at the Chief Executive's discretion. I would have thought that that would be the kind of support that actually should be entrenched in the legislation. Now, granted, obviously it's currently available, it's provided for. I would really challenge any minister who would allow a Chief Executive to remove that support, but stranger things have happened in this, in policy in this area. So I think it would be good if the minister could consider entrenching such support and allowances into legislation so that we aren't just cross-referencing in a bill like this the discretion of a Chief Executive. Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
Just, if the member will take a seat, you'll get the call back in a second, but I think we've got something procedural to sort out. Jamie Lee Ross.
For all clauses in this bill to be debated as one question.
Yes, I think also and amendments. So if we have the understanding that all questions on this bill are going to be debated as this question, is there any objection to that process? There is none. Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. That's actually quite helpful because I have some SOPs I would like to speak to. So not only should it be entrenched in law, one of our other concerns is actually we should be ensuring equity between foster carers and kinship carers across the board. Now, I think it's fair to say that actually the member has plucked out an incredibly important allowance in the clothing allowance. It's very hard to argue that that shouldn't be shared across that wider range of carers. But there are other allowances that a foster carer currently receives. And it's our view that those too should be given to kinship carers, because the fundamental question we should be asking ourselves is, if not a grandparent or a kinship carer, then who? Who is caring for that child? We know the state is an incredibly poor parent, and the state very rarely has any intention of being a long-term carer for a child in a residential facility. That is no home for a child. So if it's not a grandparent, ultimately it probably would be a foster carer who would then be entitled to that extra support. So why shouldn't a kinship carer be entitled to that support? So we have an SOP which would extend the provisions of this bill so that there is equity between foster carers and those kinship carers. I accept that there's obviously, that may be a bridge too far for the government, and I wouldn't want to, of course, so to speak, but we thought it was worth a punt because we think the argument is right. But again, that's not to diminish what Tracy Martin has done with this bill. Mr Chair, another point that I wish to raise is the commencement date. I know this will be raised by others. I want to put on record Labour's support for Jan Logie's amendment, which would mean that the commencement of this bill, essentially when families would receive this support, would be much closer to when it's passed in this House than currently it is in this bill. In this bill, we're looking at waiting until 2018. Now, lots of members in this House may, like me, have received letters from grandparents and children, photos, messages, handwritten messages, pictures, saying they've been heartbreaking to receive, Mr Chair, saying please bring this in now, we need that support. Now, the argument that's been made by the Select Committee who looked at this bill was that the government has brought in start-up payments at the beginning of each year for these families, between $250 to $400, and that really that will suffice until we hit 2018, and that's when this extra support can phase in. I'd have to say that if we're going to demonstrate any generosity, and I use that word in inverted commas, generosity, then it should be for this group. Really, to say that it would be too generous to double up on a $250 yearly payment with a clothing allowance, to me feels sadly mean-spirited. I think it's great that there is that start-up support, but when you're looking at school fees, books, uniforms, then actually that amount at the beginning of the year is barely going to touch the sides. And so I don't think it's too much to ask to have the continuity of having this kick-off straight away, being in place for those families and making sure we show that support that I think they rightly deserve. Mr Chair, To conclude, we would like to see an early commencement. We would like to see it extended a bit further, but failing that, we will of course wholeheartedly support the bill as it stands. We think it's the right thing to do, and we again thank the member for bringing it before the House.
Alfred Nara.